What's up guys, my name is Marc Steiner, and today we are talking about Apple Silicon and the M1 chip. Let's get right into it. So if you've watched my previous video about why I chose to buy an Intel-based Mac and not wait for Apple Silicon, or if you've listened to the Wide Angle podcast, listen to the podcast, I know you won't regret it. You probably already know my thoughts on Apple Silicon, and my core thoughts are still the same. It's awesome, I can't wait for it to become mainstream and in all of their products, but you probably shouldn't buy it right now if you're a professional. So Apple's presentation where they announced the new M1 chip and the new computers that are going to be taking advantage of it at the beginning was pretty informative, but also very vague. They had these very nice charts that were like, our laptops are the best and the M1 chip just blows everything out of the water. And while that might be true, yeah, you know, you can say whatever you want if you're that vague. Like, these graphs have no meaning to me and to most other tech experts. It's like, this is better than the average PC. Like, what are you calling the average PC? What do you, like, that doesn't, anyway, that's a whole other thing. But what is more impressive is the battery life increases and the fact that the MacBook Air is now fanless and how much power they're going to be able to do. They were saying some pretty cool statistics about editing and what it's actually capable of with this brand new chip, and I'm very excited for it. But again, I think we have to take it with a grain of salt. Like Apple saying, oh, you can edit 4 4K streams simultaneously in DaVinci Resolve. Well, what kind of 4K are we talking? Are we talking iPhone 4K? Are we talking Red Raw 4K? Like, not all 4K is created equal. And, you know, in Final Cut and in DaVinci Resolve, those apps are both highly optimized for the Apple ecosystem, and they have been capable of doing some crazy things on lower end processing for years now. So those claims, while awesome, I'm going to need to see proof before I can make a conclusion. But my thoughts right now are that the Apple Silicon is absolutely amazing. This is a huge step for Apple. We're seeing, you know, this chip is based off of the stuff that we're seeing in the iPhone and the iPad Air, and that chip is already incredible and competing with or beating higher end laptops in the same market. So that's kind of crazy that, you know, an iPad Air chip, the M1 chip, could compete with something like the Intel Core i9 that's in my 16-inch MacBook Pro. That's just mind-blowing that we're even having that conversation. That being said, one of my main issues is that the support isn't there yet. And a lot of people are saying, yes, you know, it's going to be a seamless transition. A lot of these apps are going to work both for Apple Silicon and Intel-based chips. And from what we're seeing, that's just not there right now. Photoshop is going to be coming in 2021, and Lightroom Classic, I believe, is not supported, but Lightroom CC is. Lightroom CC is trash compared to Lightroom Classic if you're doing actual professional work and not doing some light mobile editing. So if you're a professional, you should not be buying these computers. But to be fair, the computers that they did announce are not aimed at professionals, and I think that was a very smart move because most people buying an entry-level MacBook Air or an entry-level MacBook Pro or a Mac Mini are not doing hardcore editing and relying on their gear as part of their profession. Now you might argue the 13-inch MacBook Pro does fit the bill, but this is the lower spec MacBook Pro 13-inch with only 2 USB-C ports, so I don't think many professionals would be getting that equivalent if it was in the Intel. There's a reason why professionals are getting the 16-inch MacBook Pro and iMacs and the Mac Pro. It's because they have the power and they can run the apps. So this market they're aiming at, I think, is the perfect market, because for the people who are interested in the MacBook Air and the 13-inch MacBook Pro, they're not gonna notice that it's on Apple Silicon. They're gonna get all the benefits. Like, the people who are buying these computers at this price point are usually using it for email, web browsing, Word documents, that kind of stuff. They're not doing hardcore editing on it. But the fact that we're already having the conversation of whether or not you can have that hardcore editing on this entry-level computer is a really good sign. Again, you shouldn't be buying it if you are a hardcore professional who's doing hardcore editing, but for most people at that entry level, I think this is a really, really good deal. And what's funny to me is that all of these computers that they announced, the 13-inch MacBook Pro, the MacBook Air, and the Mac Mini, all have the same internals practically. It's just a difference of battery space and thermals because of the fans. So in all honesty, these should perform almost identically. Maybe, obviously they're going to perform a little bit better with the ones that have fans, but in terms of just performance and not including heat, these are practically identical on the inside. So whichever one you get, it doesn't really matter. And that's where I think that the MacBook Air starts becoming a lot more appealing. Like, if the MacBook Air is that good, why would you upgrade to the MacBook Pro, especially if it's only 2 USB-C ports? This is the lower end MacBook Pro. Just get the MacBook Air. Like, you're gonna have almost the same power, and it's cheaper. Like, is it worth that $300 upgrade? No, it's not. The MacBook Air is looking real crispy this year, and I'm really glad to see that the lower end of Apple's laptops are now becoming more viable and competitive against their PC counterparts, because for so long, this lower end was neglected and they kind of just left it. Like, there's a reason why the MacBook Air hadn't been updated in like 12 years. That's like ridiculous. But now we're seeing this super powerful chip in these entry-level laptops, and it just gives me hope for the future. This is our first sneak peek at what Apple Silicon is capable of, and as things start getting supported, that's when they're going to bring in their Pro lineup. And I think that was a smart move that they didn't announce everything all at once. Clearly, the M1 chip is meant for thin and light, lower end laptops. They max out at 16 gigabytes of RAM, and I think that was the smart choice to do. Again, people who are complaining about not having 32 gigs of RAM are not the people who are going to be buying the MacBook Air. Most people who need the MacBook Air do not need 32 gigabytes of RAM. They're not editing 8K red raw footage on a MacBook Air. They're buying the higher tier laptops or desktops to do that kind of work. So for the user who's using the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, it makes sense to max out at 16 gigabytes. You don't need more than that. This is an economical device. It's not the hardcore beast that all these tech people are saying, oh, I can't believe that they nerfed it. Also, I'm not surprised at all that they did not refresh the bodies. Everyone that I know in the tech community did not expect a refresh for this to be happening. We're expecting that refresh to come later on. I'm guessing they might be updated when the new Pro computers get announced with new mini LED technology, and I think that would be super cool, and Apple will eventually get to that. But for now, this is just an internal redesign, but not a physical redesign. So again, that doesn't surprise me at all, and the people complaining about that, this is a first incremental step. This isn't a massive overhaul of everything. They're slowly, gradually rolling this out and seeing how it works. So going back to those limitations of the M1 chip, that it can only have 16 gigs of RAM, and it has the 8 cores, which is awesome, especially at that price point. But I feel like with this potential in a 16-inch MacBook Pro or an iMac or a Mac Pro, we're gonna start seeing some crazy performance on those higher end machines, but they have to develop that chip to actually support all of that. So we're supporting 32, 64 gigs of RAM or more on that, whatever they're gonna call it, M2, M5 chip in those bigger, higher end machines. So that's where I think the huge strides are actually going to start being seen, is with that Pro level chip they're coming out with next year. We're gonna see a complete iMac redesign, the first in like what feels like 15 years. So that's going to be huge. I don't expect them to redo the 16-inch MacBook Pro since they recently refreshed it. Yes, it was more of a tweak than a complete redesign, but I expect them to keep the same body. And then there are rumors about a smaller Mac Pro, which would be very interesting, especially if it's running off of Apple Silicon. So we'll see what that holds for the future. But this amazing performance shouldn't really surprise anyone. When the iPad Pro came out, it was already competing in performance in benchmarks with super high-end laptops. But again, the people who are buying super high-end laptops were not buying the iPad Pro because that's not the device to get. A lot of people were wondering whether or not the Apple Silicon would focus more on performance or battery life, and we're kind of getting both. We're seeing these crazy battery specs coming out of the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro, and I'm like, you know, I'm not surprised at all. Again, if you look at the iPad Air and the iPad Pro, crazy battery life and fanless, so I'm not surprised by this, and we should have expected this. So great battery life and great performance, a lot of people are going to benefit from that. Being able to take your computer out and it has 50-40% more battery life and works well, that's incredible. And a super initial benchmark by MacRumors actually shows the MacBook Air outperforming the 16-inch MacBook Pro, which is mind-blowing, but I'm not surprised by that at all. But what will be interesting to see is whether or not that benchmark actually plays into real-world performance. And like I'm saying, Lightroom Classic is not supported, Photoshop 2021 is not supported, so you can't do these pro level things on these MacBooks right now. But Apple Silicon is going in the right direction, and in the coming years, Apple is the place to be. So I'm very excited to see the future of Apple Silicon and what that might look like in pro level computers, and what happens when these testers get their hands on these initial MacBooks and Mac Mini and do their performance tests and see just how good they perform. I have a feeling that they're going to be really, really good. And a lot of people might start thinking, I might need to look into getting a MacBook Air. In my personal opinion, if you're a professional, like I've been saying, and you bought the 16-inch MacBook Pro, don't sell it. Keep going. They're going to come out with a next-gen chip soon. People have been asking me now that Apple Silicon is out whether or not I regret buying my 16-inch MacBook Pro, and no, I couldn't be happier that I bought my 16-inch MacBook Pro, because they didn't announce a new 16-inch MacBook Pro that is mind-blowingly better than mine. And that just reinforced the idea that I know that they're going to be coming out with that in the future, and Intel is what works for me right now. So I'm not worried, I'm not regretting my purchase, I'm not selling this anytime soon. I think the time to purchase Apple Silicon, if you're a professional creative, is 2 to 3 to 4 years from now. So that's why I bought my 16-inch MacBook Pro with the Core i9, is because that lifespan will hit perfectly when I think it's the opportune time to buy into Apple Silicon. But I want to know what you guys think. Are you excited about this? Are you kind of skeptical, or are you just all in? You already pre-ordered your MacBook Air? I think it's really interesting, so I want to know what you guys think in the comment section down below. My name is Marc Steiner, and I'll see you next time.